Hey guys, Paul here to talk about big film that came out the past decade, 2011. Terrence Malick's Love or Hate, The Tree of Life. I strongly fall into the love it category for this film. I absolutely loved it from day one when I first saw it back in 2011. I remember seeing it in theaters opening day. What I really remember about that experience was just even 30 minutes in, in the film, takes you through this extended creation sequence, creation of the universe and the science behind it all. I remember about half the theater walked out on this part. And it's kind of funny looking back on it because I could see how, this is kind of one of those films where you're either going to find it to be just a bunch of nonsense, or you're going to just really connect with every frame of this film. And I just feel like every scene has a purpose and grace to it. And I have a strongly fall into the latter as far as that goes. I saw it in theaters. I loved it. I didn't really think about this film for quite some time, but recently, I've had spurts where this film will just come back to me, and when that mood hits, it really has a certain power to it. It kind of hit me more than ever on this latest viewing I've had of it. I've watched it a few times over this past week. It's just a film I particularly like to study a lot. There's just so much going on into it, so many, just endless amounts of layers I like to dissect from this film. But where to begin, really? I think a lot of the power of this film just comes by its pure contrast. It's one of the most intimate films, and it's one of the most epic films. It's got this epic scope that reminds me of like 2001: A Space Odyssey, but then it's about as intimate as a film like Boyhood or something too. But I don't even want to compare to either one of those. It's kind of a unique film entirely of its own creation. I think the film just really connects with a certain lens of perspectives, really. I think that whenever you look at the two big characters, I would say, or outside of Jack, the Sean Penn character, you got Mr. O'Brien and Mrs. O'Brien, played by Brad Pitt and Jessica Chastain. I love how they sort of represent two opposite kinds of perspectives. The film, at the very beginning, there's a monologue that talks about the way of nature versus the way of grace, narrated by Mrs. O'Brien. She talks about how Grace doesn't try to please itself, it accepts being slighted, forgotten, and disliked, accepts insults and injuries, whereas nature only wants to please itself and get others to please it too. I think that that's just such an interesting, perspective. Jessica Chastain, Mrs. O'Brien's like a very just nurturing mother. She's just overwhelmingly, she's like an angel, she's just an overwhelmingly fantastic presence for the kids and for the family. Whereas Mr. O'Brien is more of like, he's a man who's just like, look, you got to tough up, kid. You got to be ready for the real world, and all the hardships it's going to bring. He's trying to prepare his kids for just prepare them for the world. And neither perspective is necessarily wrong, but it does kind of go, I think the film does explore something of how maybe taking both perspectives too far can, potentially be a little dangerous and a little confusing for a kid. It's like you want to find a balance somewhere in between is sort of what I ultimately like the film is trying to communicate. Although the way of grace will always kind of win in the long run, the way of nature is also necessary to get by on a day-to-day basis. I love this film. I love the way this whole film is just paced and structured. It's very, very unique. The film starts off with that monologue of nature versus grace, which is, I think, what ultimately the whole film is wrestling with and dealing with. We get that. And then the film, suddenly we witness, I'm getting spoiler territory starting now. So if you haven't seen this film, I suggest watching it before watching from this point forward. Mrs. O'Brien gets a letter where, the film is very emotionally told in its storytelling. So that means that there is a lot of, jumping around. It's not exactly a linear film. I think that, I'm kind of gathering that might be what's a challenging aspect of this film. It's really non-linear. It's entirely an emotional type of storytelling where you're just kind of diving, not necessarily like in a personal way. It's more of an impersonal way of, connecting with the characters. Because I think the film begs you to put your own interpretations, your own life and memories into watching it. But anyways, Mrs. O'Brien gets a letter from the mailman. Turns out her, one of her sons had just died, Steve, and then she's just overwhelmingly devastated. And the whole chapter 2 of the film kind of deals with just, Mrs. O'Brien in the grieving stage. She's just overwhelmed. She has her, her mother's comforting her. She's just, doesn't know where to turn. She's even questioning, her faith. It's implied, it shows that she's a godly woman, and now she doesn't really, what to believe in. It's like, how could you take away my child? So then we start getting all these montages of Jack. This is the other brother, the other son of hers. As an adult, we get Sean Penn's, sort of like he grew up to be like a Sean Penn. So, we watch Sean Penn as he's just in a very existential crisis. he's going into work, and there's just this clear unfulfillment that he has. So, there's a lot of scenes where he calls his dad. And he just, he's just clearly unfulfilled. Like something's missing. And you can tell he's really in a nostalgic mood, contemplating his own childhood, what made him the way he is, what the purpose of all that was. So it's brilliant. Once we get all that, we get like Mrs. O'Brien grieving and that. Then we get this about 20-minute montage sequence of just literally the creation of the universe. And it's just, it comes out of nowhere. It splits down the middle. I think it's one of the most incredible scenes I've ever seen in a film. But there's a real purpose and reason. I think a film like this needs that. It's like, whenever you're looking at it, again, I think that the film works best if you really engage your own personality and perspectives into it. It's like Mrs. O'Brien's literally been grieving her son. So it's like, where does she turn to? So in an emotional sense, it's just sort of trying to almost give you like something of an answer. You're kind of trying to have this knowledge and understanding that there's just something greater, a force greater than us out there. It's much bigger and and it's almost like you kind of, you don't like it, but death is almost what can help appreciate that angle fully. You can fully appreciate that there's just something greater than us out there, and with time and with an understanding of that, that's sort of how you can appreciate that overwhelming wonder. I think that's what the film tries to communicate. It's just one of the most spellbinding scenes. It's actually the guy who did the special effects back in 2001: A Space Odyssey actually came back for this one. And it's just, you can tell too. I mean, it's just overwhelming. It really puts you there along with the grand, classical music that's played with it also. It's one of the best scenes I've ever seen in a film. It's up there with that scene in Space Odyssey, I'd have to say. But this time it's from more of an emotional lens. It's more of a, because, you even have Mrs. O'Brien occasionally narrating over it. Like say, like my soul, my son, like it's like a prayer. The whole film kind of has like a feeling like you're in an extended prayer. So then we get to that, and then now we get to the meat of the film, which is the upbringing of the O'Brien family. So we get all these perspectives from the mother figure and the father figure, and how they raise their three kids. It primarily focuses on Jack. Then he's also got the brother Steve, who later on turns out he dies. And there's another brother that's not really mentioned as much, but he's kind of more in the background. But yeah, so from there, all this segment starts off, and I gotta also just say some of these shots are just actually some of the best I've ever seen in a film. I think that the nature, the overwhelming beauty of the nature that's captured really just has a poetic quality to it. It's really just capturing something overwhelmingly beautiful in a way that, like, it's like, man, like, it's almost like the reality just can't even live up to how beautiful that is, but it really can in a way too. I think the film tries to communicate that, it's everything, the glory is kind of glories everywhere you look. So I love how the film starts off with the film starts off with the innocence in a lot of ways. It's like you see that the kids, the baby's born, everyone's just in a happy place. Mrs. O'Brien's just an angelic figure to him, and it's just a wonderful scene that'll really, I think if you're putting your own perspectives into it, the film is really great at making you feel something from all that. Just that pure innocence in a way that, the mom's happy and the dad's more in the background. It's not like Mr. O'Brien's not as in the picture. He's happy for him, but you can tell his strengths kind of kick in once they get a little older. It's time to be a little more disciplinary. But for this part, Mrs. O'Brien steals the show. Then we jump straight to the youth scenes. I mean, some of these scenes are just spellbinding. You watch the kids as they run out into the fields, and they're just, the way that the film captures it, it really makes you kind of it evokes that feeling of, when being a kid and running around the field, just kind of having all this endless wonder and whatnot to it. Then again, we start seeing more things from the mother's perspective. And eventually, as their kids, the father starts to kick in more, and he's very strict. Like, he's a very, you got to be tough for this world, or otherwise the world's going to eat you alive, So it's, he starts kind of getting this bone that he needs to start, giving his kids some discipline, giving them some really intense discipline. So yeah, he does all that. It gets really intense. It gets to a point where, the kid starts not liking him. He prays that he'll die because he just is like, man, I hate, he's just ruining everything. It's like a contrary to the, easygoing lifestyle that the mom was giving them. So yeah, his dad's really strict, and to a point where there's a extended segment where the father actually takes a trip. And then this makes the kids just go, what? And this is where Mrs. O'Brien, the way of grace, can almost have a bit of an error to it because, well, now that there's just no control around the house. I mean, the kids are just free to run around, endlessly and mindlessly. So, there's just no way the dad can, I mean, it's like they need that father figure in a way. And even when you're watching the scene, it eventually starts to feel kind of like aimless. Like, okay, there needs to be some control going on here. It's almost like it's too airy in a way. So it's almost a relief once the dad comes back from the trip and actually has a little bit of that. He's tough. Like, he's a little, unnecessarily tough at times. But it's very common, I imagine, especially during this time period for, a very classic strict father figure. But anywho, so when he comes back, like, you could tell that control is really back, and the kid's increasingly kind of challenged. Jack he doesn't know who he's supposed to be. Is he supposed to be more like his mom, or is he supposed to be more like his father? He doesn't really know. He's wrestling with this to a point where the parents eventually start to even see it. It's like, okay, maybe we should have, given him a bit more of a clear environment. There's just all this disconnect going on here. It's like, mom is overwhelmingly gentle, the dad's just overwhelmingly strict, tough on them. Coming from a loving place. He's not a bad person by any means. He's actually you can tell he's a good, decent man. He's just very strict. His methods are, his intentions are good, but his methods are just a little over the top. He didn't need to be that strict. It's just kind of unnecessary. It's just, yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's like, you must say, sir. You must close that door like 50 times quietly until you get it right. Stuff like that. But eventually, the kids start growing up. Another thing about Jack is, he's kind of turning into a slight bit of a misfit. Not in a dangerous way, but it just seems like you can tell he's sort of headed towards a direction. I can find myself relating, especially to like a lot of the scenes where he's struggling in school. I always kind of had a rough time in school myself, so I could kind of relate to a lot of those scenes where you just feel like, you feel like kind of dumb, you feel like you're misunderstood and just dumb just because, all right, I don't get into this particular thing. So I really, really like how it kind of explores that sort of isolation that he feels. And it's really fantastic. Then all this ends up building up to Mr. O'Brien also starts to eventually see, because the kid's just like, all right, you can just kill me if you want to, you can kick me out whenever you want. And then the father even has a moment of clarity where he's just like, wow, I was just so strict. I didn't just sit down and appreciate the roses at once through all this. I was just always so strict, always on it. And you can understand why he's on edge too, though. I mean, it's like, he hates his job. He's really like strict on everyone, but he kind of just, it's kind of coming because he's a little frustrated because he didn't make his own pursuit. He didn't reach his own kind of goals and destiny. It's not really the lifestyle he wanted to be having. He just sort of got forced into it with all the kind of work he could find. So yeah, eventually the dad gets laid off. They decide to send the kid off to another school. He feeling like he just needs some other direction since the parents feel like they kind of failed his guide and direction. And that's a really touching scene too. It's like throughout the whole film, there's like a lot of scenes of those childhood innocence. There's like the minor conflict that kids will typically get into. It's like the kids get curious, they start sneaking around, get into a little trouble. But I like to watch it because when you're a kid, like a lot of these things seem like such a big deal. And whenever I watch this film, it makes me think about that. It's like, wow, I remember when that actually seemed massive when I snuck around the neighbor's house. But then you grow up and it's like, oh, we're just being kids, and it's like in the grand scheme of things, those things are just so minor. Compared to just, the real conflict of like mysteries of life of just like, well, there's kind of the death out there. There's always big things that are genuine mysteries. So I love how the film just shows that, there's always just really bittersweet scenes, where the kids are just, they're almost like in tears. Like it's like they're breaking down because it's like, wow, like we're just getting older. Just that typical feeling of, where, wow, we're losing our childhood here. So also not true, but at the time, there's always that time and place where you feel that way. But anywho, after all this happens, we get to just another spellbinding sequence that matches the brilliance of that creation sequence, which is a vision of eternity. We're back to Jack as an adult, Sean Penn's Jack. He's having, it's like kind of implied through an emotional way of storytelling that this is where his head's been. He's been, reflecting on all these times and moods and how they sort of add up to the kind of person he is. So he ends up, we kind of break a fourth wall again. I guess, it's hard to really know what the label is exactly, but it's like a vision of eternity, I would say. It's a vision of the afterlife. You got Jack's just going to this like vision where he can see all of his memories laid out, unfolded out into one segment. I kind of consider this sort of like something of a heaven-like figure, heaven image, heaven scenery. We see him as he meets all of his parents, not older, not younger. It's just like, they just took him right out of, as they were from childhood. And it's like they're still there. And I think what all this implies is like, well, there's something greater that, we're building up to. And that's especially sort of like that way of grace, of living. And it's just like, you want to know that one day, all these memories, all these, times that we've had here on Earth will eventually, will add up to something greater. And I think that the film has a very hopeful message of just, You know, like just be good to others, you know, be loving it to others. And, you know, I think you'll see that this will be rewarding. You know, maybe we'll find this once again in an afterlife. We'll all meet once again, you know, in a better place. I think it's just indescribably an incredible film. It's one of the most touching, powerful, magnificent films I've ever seen. So yeah, that's the Tree of Life. That's my take on the Tree of Life, at least. Yeah, if you're, and it's not for everyone. I definitely acknowledge that. You know, I know most people I know don't care for this film, and I get it. You know, it's definitely one of those love or hate kind of films. I think that's my take on why I think it's a grand masterpiece, one of the best films of recent times. And I think a lot of it's, you know, it might just come down to the kind of person you are, what speaks to you. You know, I think for me, from a very young age, I've always had kind of a nostalgic bone. You know, and I've never known why exactly, but it's like I've always had this weird awareness that, you know, like every moment's just kind of a moment passing in time, and you know, I just kind of like to live up to the fullest extent possible, because I know that the times are going to change. You know, cruddier times will be ahead. So, you know, why not embrace the now, enjoy the now? The film just kind of adds up with that kind of mindset of an outlook on life and perspective. So it's one of my top 10 favorite films for sure. And I recommend it. Recommend checking it out. So yeah, that's my take on the Tree of Life. Must see it if you haven't already. And all right, now I'll be taking on some David Lynch films next. We're going to probably be reviewing Blue Velvet next. So stay tuned for that. Take care.